Hello and good afternoon, everyone, or good morning, depending on which part of the world you are, and joining us here this afternoon in Dubai. We're in HR Summit Digital Week. This is our second day. So for those who joined it yesterday at our webinar which was hosted from Nestle, I would like to thank you for joining us today again. The topic today that we'll be addressing is on e-learning and the digital platforms that will be best fit for your business. We know that there is a lot of advancement in that field, so that's why we chose that topic as one of the key ones for our first digital week at the webinar. And today here with us, we've got Mr. Sriram Rajan, who is the head of OD and talent at SIG Combibloc Obican. And I will leave it to Sriram now to tell us a bit more about the e-learning and what will be the best solution for our businesses. Sriram?
Thank you, Nina. Appreciate the introduction. I just want to confirm if my screen's visible.
Yes, I can see it perfectly on my screen, which I'm assuming that everyone else can see it. If you have any issues, you can always make a comment in the question box. And also this recording, you will see the recording of this webinar next week, early next week. So as well, you'll be able to review the presentation slides.
Lovely. So thanks for that. And I'm going to jump in straight away. Broadly, we hope to accomplish, or I hope to accomplish these three topics in the next 30 to 35 minutes. The way in which I hope to structure this webinar today is for me to walk you through our story or our journey in CBOB in terms of what are some of the successes, challenges, learnings we've had in picking the kind of e-learning platforms that we have for our organization. And what are some of the lessons or insights we can share with you in terms of depending on where you are on your journey as far as e-learning is concerned. I'd then like to spend about 25-30 minutes taking questions to ensure that we walk away with as much clarity as we can at the end of the 60 minutes today, right? So I'll tell you a little bit about my organization. I'll tell you a little bit about me. For those of you who are wondering why I'm not visible, I will make myself visible towards the end of the session when we do our Q&A. I will get into a deep dive in terms of our journey at CBOB, really to share exactly what our journey was, what exactly were our learnings, and what are some of the successes we saw in the approach that we took. Success also in terms of some of the things that you can actually avoid when you sort of embark on the journey of digital learning for your organization, and what are some of the key considerations you need to keep in mind when you sort of start this journey. Right. So I'll start with CBOB, who we are. We are a business to a business model, which is why a lot of you may not have heard about us. But who are we as an organization? We've been in the business for about 80 years. What we do is we're essentially in the business of aseptic packaging. And for people who've heard of Tetra Pak, we are exactly in the same business. We are the second biggest globally, and we're present in about 65 countries with close to about 220 partners that we sort of work with across the globe in the consumer goods and packaging space. From an employee standpoint, we're about 5,000 people globally. We spread across 40 countries across the different continents. We're about 700 people in the region, headquartered out of Dubai. The factory is based out of Riyadh, which is where most of our population sits. In terms of revenue, you can see the figures out there. We clocked a revenue of about 1,700 plus million euros in 2016. From a production capacity, we produced close to about 32.9 or close to about 33 billion packs, which really sort of cater to close to about 10,000 plus products in about 50 categories. Yeah. So that's who we are as a business. I will at a later stage share a link where you can get to know a little more about the organization that hopefully will come through as a follow-up in an email from Nina. Moving on to who I am, because we're going to be spending the next 60 minutes together. So I thought I'll share a little bit about myself. My last assignment before I came here was with Deloitte Consulting back in India. I worked with them for close to about 2 years. A year and a half into Deloitte, I essentially went through only 16 rounds of interviews over 6 months. So that was a brave battle that I fought to land the job at Deloitte. About a year and a half into Deloitte, I figured that I'm ready to take on bigger challenges in life. So that's when I decided to get married, right? And that's my beautiful wife and me that you see on the screen over there. We actually shot this picture right in the middle of the street, and it was really raining. So what you see over there are raindrops. My wife was in Dubai, I was in India. So what we'd done is to sort of go back and give ourselves a year to ensure that, we sort of get together eventually over a year. 6 months down, we decided and we figured that a long distance marriage wasn't really working. So that really meant that I basically said no to Deloitte and I moved to Deutsche Bank. I moved to Dubai after having quit Deloitte. So I took a break for about 6 months before I landed the job that I'm in currently. I've been with SIG, Combibloc, Obekan for the last 3.5 years. Over the last 3.5 years, of course, our families also increased. We have this beautiful little soul called Kian, my son, who's now a very, very important part of our lives. And from a professional perspective, it's been a great ride. The team that you see out there on the screen won the award for the best leadership program in the region at the HR Summit last year in 2017, right? So that's a little bit about my life. That's a little bit about who I am and the company that I work for. And that's also a little bit about the power of digital, right? Because that's exactly what digital does. It has this unbelievable ability for you to gather data from different places, present it in the form that you have to, and make us feel connected with each other. In the absence of the technology and the leverage that we have today, all of us, or I would not be interacting with you and you would not be interacting with me, right? So it has this amazing capability for you to access information when you want it. It has this amazing capability for you to get empowered and share the kind of information that you want to, and also get empowered enough to access the kind of information that you have to, right? And those were the key themes that we kept in mind when we looked at what are some of the things that we want to consider, what are some of the things that we want to keep in mind when we look at a digital strategy as far as learning at CBOB or Combibloc Obekan is concerned, right? So over the next 15 to 20 minutes, what I will attempt to do is to walk you through what are some of the key things we kept in mind, what was our starting point in our journey as far as digital is concerned, what were some of the roadblocks that we faced, what were some of the challenges, and how did we go about picking the right kind of solutions that we felt were a good fit for the organization. So where we really started was by defining our goal to step back and ask ourselves these 3 questions. And I'm going to start in the reverse order. So one of the big questions that we asked ourselves was around what are some of the data points we need to keep in mind from a people perspective when we decide what is it that we want to accomplish by going the digital way. What are some of the key stakeholder expectations that some of our critical players in the organization have from the learning team when you talk about a digital learning strategy? How does the current setup in terms of the elements that we have in the organization today really go back and support the kind of strategy that we're looking at? These were 3 very important questions we were asking ourselves, right? So I'm going to start with the 3rd question first in terms of what were some of the key data points that we kept in mind. So when we looked at the entire strategy, some of the things that we kept in mind was feedback that came out from 360 feedback that came out from engagement surveys, specifically around learning and development, where people were saying that we spread across 13 countries in the region, right? So one of the big asks that our employees had was to say, we want to have a unique and a very unified learning experience at CBOB. It doesn't matter whether I'm sitting in Dubai or Riyadh or Tunis or Libya. When you talk about a learning experience, I'd like for the learning experience to be the same. I don't want it to be driven by a particular location or not have any limitations around it. So we looked at a lot of data from different data sets within the organization to say what is it that our employees really want. So that was a big guiding principle or a big starting point for us. The second thing that we kept in mind, and one of the things that a lot of our stakeholders, especially the executive team, had for us was around the fact if we were to go back and make an investment of X number of dollars in this entire initiative, what's the return on investment? What's the benefit to the organization? How will you go back and showcase the impact or what you do from a digital perspective? So that was a very, very key question that a lot of our stakeholders asked to say, why do we need to change? Why do we need to go digital? What's the value to our people? What's the value to the organization in us taking the digital route? The third thing, after having assessed all of the challenges specifically to go back and understand what the organization expectations were, the one thing that we went back and mapped it back to was to say, how do our current practices, does the current LMS support the kind of strategy? Does the current LMS support the kind of expectations that our employees have of us? The answer to that was a no, because some of the following expectations that came out were around, I want to be able to access learning whenever I want it, wherever I want it. I need to be able to access learning in a bite-sized manner. I don't necessarily want to travel, and how can I go back and decide the pace at which I learn at my own convenience, at my own ability? And of course, there was this consistent need around having a similar training experience no matter which location I'm based out of, right? So our current LMS was not really catering to some of these dynamic expectations that people had, which really led us to sort of go back and say, you know what, we need to definitely go back and now start looking at a different platform. How do you now go back and decide that, right? So our big takeaway for this really was to say, before you start your journey around digital transformation, before you start your journey around digital learning, begin with the end in mind to clearly know what the stakeholder expectations are. What do the learners expect from you as a learning organization? And then go back and identify what are some of the platforms that cater to that need. So that, I think, was a very, very big and a very important first step for us to consider, and some very important questions for us to ask. We then moved on to, going back and then saying, great, so now that we know that the current LMS is not meeting the requirements, now that we know that the existing learning ecosystem will not deliver what it needs to deliver, how do I really go back and pick what's right? Right? Because we're living in a world of choices today. I was reading an article just last week where one of the articles that I was reading mentioned that as of June 2017, in the Silicon Valley alone, there were close to about 5,300 startups that had sprung up in that year, right? That's the number of startups in one city alone. When you multiply that, that philosophy to the globe, we're living in a world today where lack of choices is no longer a problem. The challenge is actually reverse. We have way too many options. A lot of these companies do way too good a selling strategy. They'll convince an Eskimo to maybe go back and buy a refrigerator as well. But that's the world we live in today, right? The lack of choice is not a problem, but having too many of them really, really is a big challenge, right? So we needed to go back and step back and say, what is it that we need to consider? How do we pick what is right for my organization, right? The first thing that we went back and did was to go back and look at our notes, was to go back and look at the expectations, and what is it that motivated our employees to sort of learn more. So we have a large part of our population that's on the field at the client side. They do not really have access to the office or the locational office or the head office for that matter. But these are people who are very eager to learn, right? So one of the things that they came back and said to us was, despite of me not being present in the office, I need to have the comfort of being able to access the same learning at the same time like an office employee in Dubai or Riyadh. How can you give that to me? Uh, the leadership came back and asked us questions around, if we go back and start uploading content around compliance, around code of conduct, how can you ensure that that content is safe? Because information technology, data security has become a big point of focus. Facebook has been in the spotlight for that, but that's something that we needed to consider as well. If we're going digital and we start uploading certain confidential information around the organization, how do we look for a platform that's not just accessible across multiple platforms or devices, but how do we also ensure that the platform that we're picking is a safe platform such that no confidential information would be breached ever with regards to us training our employees? The third thing that we considered was also around the fact, because a lot of businesses today, if you look around, a lot of organizations partner with the business, right? So content creation today is not really the job of a traditional L&D team. You'll find a lot of SMEs and experts from the business coming in and curating content with the learning team as well. That's the third question that we asked ourselves. Will this platform allow for users to also curate and contribute to the content that we want to put to the platform? The fourth question or the fourth expectation that our stakeholders and our learners had was around the following, right? They said, how can you ensure that while I'm sitting where I am, I get to access the best of content from the best of universities? How can you ensure some of that? So those were the three or the four broad things that we really consider to sort of go back and say, we cannot really use the traditional ways. We can't really prescribe what kind of learning people should take, because learners today are really deciding what they need, when they need it, and how they want to consume it. Third, how do we also go back and ensure that all the company information and confidential information that we put out there is really safe and not open to any breach, right? So what we really took away from that was, dated approaches no longer work. Traditional LMSs do not really serve our purpose. What we need is something that's far more dynamic. What we need is something that will support learning the way in which learners want to learn, not the way in which the learning team wants the learners to learn. So those were some of the things that we kept in mind when we were deciding on what's the right platform, what's going to work for us, how do we decide what's the best thing for us? Because all these platforms, when we looked at them, looked incredibly awesome, looked very dependable, and looked equally good, right? But what really kept us focused on the choice that we made eventually, which I will share with you towards the end of the webinar, were these four questions that we were constantly focusing on to say, these will be the guiding principles for us to ensure that we land the right platform. Having done that, and I don't know how many of you are aware about this, but Facebook, for example, has close to about 2.2 billion active users, right? That's about 30% of the global population. If you were to look at Snapchat, the number of active users that log on to Snapchat every day is close to about 180 million. So if you multiply that by 5, you're talking about close to about 1 billion active users using Snapchat in about 5 days, right? My reason to share this today is because the world is connected socially or on the social platforms like they have been never before, right? Imagine 1 billion active users on a Snapchat platform in just about 5 days. 30% of the global population being active on Facebook as we speak, right? So the way forward, or the era that we really in, is everybody is connected to each other, whether you realize it or not, right? And that's the one thing that we wanted to keep in mind when we looked at a learning strategy as well. How do we ensure when we pick an e-learning platform, people feel that they're connected to each other, people feel that they're contributing to each other's learning, people feel that they have the visibility to know what's happening in the other person's learning journey, right? So the three questions that we asked ourselves when we were looking at this particular aspect as far as digital learning is concerned was the following, right? Can the learners learn from each other? Do they have the ability to contribute to each other's learning? Do they have the ability to contribute to each other's learning was the one question that we asked. The second question that we asked was the following, right? How do you today empower every learner in the organization to be an author themselves? Because people today are consuming learning on their mobile phones, on their laptops, as they're traveling from one place to the other. So everybody has a point of view. Everybody hence has something to contribute, right? How do you use that leverage within the organization for this knowledge to come in and start creating content for the organization? So how do you empower your learners to also become curators of not just their own learning, but how do they also start helping their peers to start learning from them? The third thing that we of course asked was around, people are big fans of the number of likes that they get on Facebook, the number of followers they have on Twitter. So we wanted to use the same philosophy over there to say, how do we go back and start recognizing and rewarding people for certain positive learning behaviors that they display on the platform? So we were very consciously looking for learning platforms that actually allow us to recognize and reward positive learning behaviors we see on the platform. This for us was a very, very important aspect because, like I said earlier, going social and being socially connected is something that's very second nature to people today. And if you do not use that philosophy, personally for us, it's something we did not want to ignore when we were looking at the platforms that we wanted to bring into our organization, right? So the philosophy that we followed over here was, when we go the digital way, how do we ensure that we make everybody feel like they are a winner? They're contributing not just to their own learning journey, but to the other people's learning journey as well. So that's one important aspect that we kept in mind when we went digital within our organization. Cost, of course, is a big, big aspect. When you look at the last, I think, ATD or the Deloitte report, you'll see about 30 to 40% of the organizations are really restructuring the way in which they're spending money, right? A lot of the focus now, for example, is moving into building in internal expertise, right? For us, for example, while we did not go back and cut down on our training budget, we were expected to do close to about 20 to 25% more on the same budget that we got as last year, right? So while it wasn't really a cut in terms of a monetary expense, the expectations that the organization had from the learning team were that much more higher. This really forced us to go back and start looking at creative ways to deliver the same kind of learning, but through a different medium, right? And cost became a very, very important element of that. Some of the things we kept in mind, hence from a cost perspective, were the following, right? We compared every platform and we went back and really bargained really hard or focused really hard on how much does a license cost me per year per person? What is the competitive advantage that different organizations have amongst themselves? And what is it that they have to offer to us? The other thing that we internally discussed was to go back and really decide what percentage of our overall budget do we want to go back and start spending on digitization, right? Because you must realize that there's a lot of tools available, there's a lot of options available. You pretty much want to take any one of them that comes your way. But what really kept us aside was we had a very clear plan to say, when we start out, for example, 15% of our budget is what we'd go back and invest on digital learning. Depending on the success that we see, we'll start investing more. So we took a very, very conservative approach in terms of the investments that we were making. We wanted to really follow the philosophy of less is more and cost is key to ensure that we have a successful strategy, right? So when we started our journey as far as digital learning is concerned, we started with a pilot of about 20 licenses. As we speak today, we're at a 550 licenses across the organization, and we're averaging between a 70 to an 80% utilization on the e-learning platforms that we have within our organization, right? The third thing that we kept in mind from a cost perspective was also around the fact that we need to be very, very conscious of what courses do we really digitize, what courses do we really keep as instructor-led courses. So the simple philosophy that we followed was really this, right? Skill building as far as, let's say, communication skills, technical skills, functional skills, code of conduct are things that we've gone back and digitized. Things around coaching, things around leadership, development programs that really shift and shape paradigms are things that we've not digitized completely. We've still kept them and we will continue to keep them as instructor-led training programs. But what we're using and where we're using digital in that is to ensure that people use the digital platforms on their mobile learning phones as a daily reminder for them to remember certain key concepts that they cover within a training classroom as far as leadership training is concerned. So that's something that we kept in mind very consciously, because the kind of courses that you curate, the kind of courses that you digitize is very, very critical to the cost component as well. So we took a very conscious decision of being very careful around this. The last thing, of course, that we kept in mind was what's the ability for us to customize the content and how much would it really cost us. So those are some of the things that we wanted to keep in mind to ensure that we're not projecting a very high cost, because getting a buy-in from the business was very, very critical from a cost perspective as well. So the key takeaway here, we took a very conventional approach. We showed the success to the business leaders. And once we saw some early successes, we then went back and sort of built a business case to go back and start investing more money on the digital philosophy that we follow in the organization today, right? So start conservative, show some early successes, build a business case to go big, and then really go back and start piloting from on a bigger scale as well. That's a journey that we really followed, right? So having done all of this, what were some of the things that we sort of learned or took away in our journey? Because we've now been doing this for close to about a year and a half, 2 years. We've seen participation rates go high as 99% in the organization. We've seen it come down to close to about a 60%. We're now back on about an 80%, right? So obviously we've had our lessons, we've had our journey in really going back and sort of understanding what are some of the things we could have done differently, and that's what I wanted to share with you. Like I said, information and data security is very, very important to us. I'm sure it would be to a lot of you guys in your organizations as well. So that's a very clear thing that we sort of did a due diligence on to understand how safe and secure is the information that we put out there on the platforms is concerned. Obviously, this was baked into the contracts and the NDAs that we signed with these agencies. So that's a definite point of focus that we focused on quite a bit. The second thing that we came back and asked ourselves, both from a confidentiality and an effectiveness perspective, was to take a prudent approach around saying we don't want to take everything digital, right? Both in terms of confidentiality, one, and second, also in terms of impact. Which is why in terms of impact, what we've kept digital is things around skill building. Courses that really go back and shift paradigms are things we've not taken digital completely. We follow a blended learning model around that. These platforms are content hungry monsters, right? So you have to keep feeding these platforms with new content. You have to ensure that the learners have an engaging experience every single day that they log into these platforms, right? Because we've been faced with situations where a training course by a particular team can get consumed in about 2 days, and the same training content does not get consumed by people for about 2 to 3 weeks, right? So there will be always a bunch of people who are very, very enthusiastic and the ones who are not so enthusiastic. What you need to watch out for is how much you commit to, how you manage the expectations of the learners around you. Because the one big thing that people don't realize when you start feeding content on this is you cannot recycle the content that you put out there, because learners, once they start getting excited, they want more of it. So content creation can be quite a time consuming process. identifying videos, digitizing that content can be a painstakingly long process. So be very conscious of what you commit to your organization, how you manage expectations around what will go digital, and what's the pace at which you will start updating the content as well. Because we had a lot of feedback coming to us initially where people would finish the training content in about 2 days when we'd actually planned it for 2 weeks. And we had a bunch of people, our employees, really coming up to our offices and saying, when are you rolling out the next module? I'm already bored of what you've put out there, right? Which is a good problem to have, but that also translates into potentially a lot of work that you and your teams will have to manage when you go digital as far as learning is concerned. Last but not the least, I think what really motivated people in our organization was how we recognize them, right? So as you work on a development plan to digitize learning, it's also very, very important for you to work on an engagement plan to really articulate and strategize how you will engage the entire organization as you shift paradigms from classroom learning to digital learning. Some of the ways in which we managed to do this successfully was to run a monthly communication campaign. We used to send out a fortnightly update to the leadership in the initial days. And when I say initial days, I mean the first 6 months, we'd go back and send out an update to the executive team every fortnight on what the participation rates are like, what's the knowledge shift, show them some early wins around what's the behavior shift percentage like, what's the utilization like, and how well are people learning in terms of knowledge shift. So when we started showing those numbers to the leadership, they started seeing some immediate value in us bringing about these digital platforms to the organization. Because we never had a forum or a platform where we could go back and communicate or really articulate the impact of a training program within 2 weeks of rolling it out, right? So we picked out certain key messages that we wanted to communicate to specific audiences to ensure that everybody is engaged in this new digital movement that we're launching within the organization. So with the leadership, it was about impact. With the learners, it was about recognition and sending out emails on a monthly basis to say which team has improved the most, which individual has improved the most, which person has been logging in consistently into these digitized platforms. So there would be communications going out on a monthly basis recognizing these individuals, which played a very, very critical role in us achieving a 99% participation rates for a consistent 4 months. And people were really excited about not just learning, but being recognized across locations as well. So that's something that you may want to sort of go back and consider as well. It's not just about creating content and digitizing it. That's one aspect of it. But the other important aspect is to also think through how will you engage, how will you sustain the interest levels of people to ensure that they log into these learning platforms every single day, right? We've also identified learning champions who drive this across their different functions and regions. So they play a very critical role in ensuring that people are excited and engaged in learning this, right? So optimize the areas that you want to impact. And when you optimize that, of course, that's also a very efficient way to really go back and start maximizing the impact that you deliver to the organization. So those are some of the things that you may want to keep in mind when you sort of go back and look at a digital strategy for your organization. I just want to quickly touch on the takeaways and then really open it out to questions. So things that you want to keep in mind when you go digital is what's the goal? What is it that you're trying to accomplish? So really begin with the end in mind. Consider what's right for you and your organization, because what may work for a particular organization may not necessarily work for you. A good way to do that is for you to engage with your stakeholders, both the leadership and the learners, and to understand what is it that they expect as far as learning and learning behaviors are concerned within the organization. Look at how you can connect people through the platform. Does it have the ability to become a learning social network within your organization? Does the platform allow you to recognize people, reward them for the investment that they make in developing themselves and other people? Cost, of course, is important. So depending on what your budgets look like. Our approach was to take a conservative approach, show the impact to the business, and then ask for more money and a higher investment, which worked for us. Last but not the least, be very careful about what you commit to, because this can turn out to be a lot of work, not just in terms of content development, but also in terms of keeping people engaged on the platform that you're rolling out within your organization, right? So where can you really go from here, or what can you really do? I just wanted to leave you with a few recommendations on platforms that you can look at. So from a content library perspective, what we've really used is Coursera. It's something that's worked really, really well for us. We've had a great success in using this platform. Skillsoft is another great platform that has a multitude of courses that you can log into and instantly access. What you don't have over here is the option for you to customize content. But if you're looking at off-the-shelf programs from some really good universities, these are two platforms that you may want to consider. From a mobile learning platform, what we have used within our organization is Exonify. We have about 550 licenses, and we have participation rates of about an 80% as we speak. Great platform from a content customization perspective, great platform from an employee recognition perspective, great platform from a data analytics perspective. So I can today, sitting on my desk on my mobile phone, I can track the improvement that every single team is making. It doesn't take me much, about 3 to 4 clicks, and I know exactly what's going on in my organization as far as learning is concerned and learning behaviors are concerned. Alencom is another tool that you may want to look at. Great tool again. And from a massive open online courses or MOOCs, you have edX and NovoEd are two platforms that you may want to consider. But really, those are the things that we're doing. We do not look at this, or we do not see this substituting instructor-led training. I think it's a great opportunity for us to blend the two, and that's been working really well for us. And these are some options and things that you may want to consider when you start looking at digital learning and digital transformation for learning organizations within your companies and organizations. Yeah. So I'm going to pause right here. I'm going to open it out to questions and see what can we answer or what can we clarify.
Thank you so much for this insightful presentation, Sriram, and for taking us on your journey. Like, it's all these takeaways. I'm sure that no matter where our listeners are now, they will find, the helpful elements of that. In terms of, we had some issues with the connection, I understand, from some of the listeners. The recording is absolutely undisrupted here. I've been, hearing you perfectly, but from my colleague who is as well kind of joined as a listener, we know that a few times there was a hiccup. But however, the recording, just to answer it, the recording is undisrupted and it will be shared to you shortly after the webinar actually finishes. Yeah, we see some comments here from people saying, hi Sriram, thank you, very nice presentation. Yes, you get a copy from the session. Yeah, so I wanted more to ask you, you mentioned, and I think kind of working on the HR Summit and Expo on the tech side of the conference, to be honest, one of the main challenges that I hear from people now is, you mentioned it, but creating that buy-in element, from leadership, mainly to invest. You mentioned the platforms that you're using, and I think they're a good start, for people, but what would you say are the main kind of, challenges that you faced, getting the buy-in from higher leadership, to actually invest in more digital platforms and to enable kind of people to, as you mentioned, to use that content on demand? Like, where was the main challenge from your perspective?
And that's a great question, Nina. So I think it wasn't so much about the cost as much as it was about being able to show the value in what we were trying to accomplish, right? So like I said, what really worked for us was to go back and take a very gradual approach around digitizing learning, right? So the team did not go back to the leadership and say, we want to buy 200 licenses or 300 licenses and we want to go completely digital. What we did instead was to roll out a program. We picked about 20 people as a pilot, and what we told the leadership was, how about we go back and run a pilot for about 20 to 30 people? Why don't we see the impact and the value this can bring in? And would you be open to sort of going back and then relooking at the numbers and negotiating to see if this makes sense for us? So that's the approach that we went back into, because in my experience, when the leadership comes back and questions the investment, what they're really coming back and questioning is not the investment, but the value that they will get in return, right? And an easy way to go back and show that is to run it on a smaller group and say, you know what, this is the value that it can potentially bring. What do you think about this? Now imagine if 20 people could benefit from this. Imagine if we were to go back and have a similar experience with 200 people. What do you think could that do to the organization? And that's something that our leadership found very powerful. And I think that's an approach that worked really, really well for us. So start small, show the value, don't ask for too much and commit to too much and raise the expectations. Make a modest start, keep the benchmark fairly reasonable, and then work on upping your game in terms of the kind of impact that you can really deliver, something that's worked really well for us.
Okay. Thank you. We've got additional questions now coming up. And I think this is actually one very, very important question for you to answer now. And it's, have you seen any shift and through the learners using the digital platforms, and have you measured these shifts?
Yes, and great question. And I'm going to answer that in two parts. So I have, I've actually had the joy of seeing two major shifts happen. So learning has now become, or the participation on Exonify, for example, has now become a conversation that happens in cafeterias, happens in pantries, and happens in a smoking zone as well. I'm not too updated on the smoking zone currently because I've sort of quit smoking very recently. But up until when I was participating in all these three zones, the one thing that really stands out is a paradigm shift. So I've had people who walked up to me and asked me, did you log into Exonify today? Are you consuming the learning that you're supposed to consume, right? So the entire behavior and perspective around learning has totally shifted with Exonify coming in, because people now push each other to learn, and the learning team doesn't have to go out to the stakeholders, pushing them to learn or attend training programs. So that's one big shift that we've seen within the organization. The second shift that we've seen is what Exonify helps you do is to really go back and start tracking the knowledge shift. We have, over the last 1.5 to 2 years that we've been using Exonify, we've seen on an average a knowledge shift of about 23 to 25% on about 8 to 10 topics that we've launched on Exonify in the last 1.5 to 2, right? Which is big. I mean, because traditionally the industry standards range between 15 to 20%. But the power of the tool and the competition that we've built around it is so impactful. We've actually seen a knowledge shift of about 23 to 25% on an average. A few of the behavior surveys that we've rolled out in Exonify, we've seen a behavior shift of about an 8 to a 12% on leadership styles in terms of the pre and the post feedback that people have got. But that's something that we're trying to do more work around. So what we've gathered to do is bring in a momentum within the organization. We've tried to successfully map the knowledge shift, but behavior shift is something that we're working on currently.
Okay, thank you so much for this. I think using the webcam, it's making sometimes the connection a bit slow, but what I know now, it's absolutely fine. Just giving you heads up. There is a question which basically Ala is asking for suggestion if you can recommend any platforms for microlearning.
I would definitely recommend Exonify for sure. It's something that's worked really well for us. So I'm a big fan of that. I definitely ask people to try that out. The other platform that we played around with a little bit was Grovo. It again promotes a lot of micro learning. You can access that on your computer. So that's again a great platform that you may want to sort of look at. I've also mentioned a couple of other platforms on my presentation, which I'm sure you'll share later, Nina. But these are the 2-3 platforms that you can immediately start looking at, which I think are fairly credible and useful.
Yeah, thank you. There's another really good question and very important one, and it's how do you manage the mindset and any resistance from employees from moving classroom training to more digital platforms?
Good question, actually. So I think communication over here is key, right? And the big way to manage any resistance is to counter that with a lot of positive reinforcement. What do I mean by that? So the minute, for example, our employees started seeing employees in Libya, for example, being recognized across 13 regions for doing a great job as far as their learning journey is concerned, it motivated 10 other employees to say, you know what, I want to see my name on that email when it goes out. So we were not just rewarding individuals, but we started rewarding teams as well, right? So we had champion teams of the month, we had champion individuals of the month. So not only were we going back and motivating individuals, but we were also, that was our way of putting a little bit of positive pressure, if I can call it that really, but putting a little bit of positive pressure on the line managers as well to say, you know what, go back and start driving performance on your team as well, because if you want your team to be recognized in front of 50 other teams, this is the way for you to go back and do it. So I'd say really go back and counter any cynicism with a lot of positive reiteration, recognize people, communicate regularly, go back and reward positive behavior in whichever way that you can, right? Because we have a separate reward scheme for this learning strategy where people, let's say, for example, get to go out for a dinner with a COO, they get the COO's parking lot for a day, for example, or they get a day off to work from home. Those are some of the things. So it doesn't have to necessarily have a big budget, but if you apply some bit of thought to it and recognize people, I think that will be a good counter for you to sort of minimize any cynicism or resistance that you may feel.
Thank you. A question from Gregory. He's asking, how did you integrate short university courses in your digital learning platforms?
Wow, that's a great question. So what we, and that's something that we've done this year. The platform that we're using is Coursera. How did we integrate that is really to go back and do 2 things. We linked it back to the business strategy, that's one. So we're driving, for example, 13 strategic projects in the organization this year to sort of go back and say, if we do these 10 to 13 things, we will get the kind of results that we want to, right? So we've moved from a competency-based learning model to a strategy-based learning model this year. We're no longer talking about competencies in isolation, but we're linking those competencies to business impact from when we start designing courses, right? So we went back and said, if these are the 5 things that the business wants to achieve this year, what are some of the courses that we need to run for individuals? We then went back and identified those courses and picked those courses from Coursera to say, these are the teams, these are the individuals that will be consuming these courses because these are the people who are supporting that project. So that's how we've gone back and blended that into our learning strategy. It's no longer about competencies alone. It's also about the business strategy to say, if we have these 5 courses available from these universities, which one should we pick? Which is the most relevant to our business strategy, and how can we maximize the impact around that? So those are some things we did to sort of go back and include those courses. What we're also doing in the interim, if there are any courses that run for more than 3 months in a virtual setup, we've organized for 2-hour catch-up sessions to happen in between these 4 to 6 months, where learners come together, share their journey to say what did they learn from the course so far, and we get someone from the business to come in and talk about how relevant and how important this course is and what are some of the things they need to keep in mind as they go through that learning journey. So those are some of the things that we're doing to experiment with this particular aspect of learning.
Okay, thank you. A question from Susie. What is the most engaging learning tool or preferred platform that you're using?
Tough one to answer. I wouldn't really vote for anyone. I think more than the tool, it's about what you do to engage your audience, right? So I don't think it's as much about your tool as much it's about your engagement strategy. If you recognize people, if you know what you want, and if you know how the tool can add value to your organization, I'd really say that all tools are equally engaging, right? So think through your engagement strategy, right? Make this about yourself. Make this about your organization, right? Don't make this about the tool. Be very clear about one, what you want. Second, how will you engage the audience? Third, how will you recognize them? Fourth, does it meet my cost aspect? If any of these tools that is meeting these four critical requirements, you just have to do a lot of hard work around then engaging your employees. So really, it's not about the tool, it's about how you use the tool and what you make of it, honestly.
Okay, thank you so much. Another interesting question, and it's related to how do you convince employees who are reluctant to digital learning just because this is not their learning style?
Good question. So, like I said, so we do the wall of shame, and the ones who don't, we do the wall of fame, and the ones who don't really see their names on the wall of fame, get added on to the wall of shame, if you will. But there are two to three things that we've done. We really go back and recognize people. So we've used positive iteration as a very strong concept to encourage employees to do that. Learning has now been integrated as a part of the performance management philosophy within the organization, right? So we have a KRA of 2 learning days per person in a year across all functions and regions. So that is now something that's being tracked as a part of everybody's individual performance, if you will, on an annual basis. Because we strongly believe, what doesn't get measured doesn't get done, right? So that's something that we've been consciously working on. We're tracking that, we're reporting that out, we're rewarding people to show positive behaviors. Last but not the least, this is also discussed on a half-yearly basis with the leadership team to sort of get their buy-in constantly, right? So 3 key things: get the leadership to buy this in, get them to drive it, don't be the only ones driving this. Second, make this a part of their performance measures formally if you can. Third, recognize and give positive strokes to people who, leading by example, have a very strong engagement plan in place to deal with people who are not really clued on to this. Will this completely cure it? No, it will not. You'll still have some outliers. But I'd say if you have about 80 to 85% of the organization engaged in this, it's a job well done.
Okay, another question from Gregory. And it is, what is your experience with using digital learning to support employees who are going through professional certification programs?
I'm not sure what to make of that question, really, because we haven't had any such instances, and second, I'm not sure what's the linkage between professional certification. But basis what I'm understanding, if a particular person is going through, let's say, a certification on coaching, for example, what we've done is to go back and link that back to courses that are available on these platforms, which will supplement that journey, right? So, for example, we had somebody in the supply chain team who was going through a professional certification around supply chain. So we've gone back and identified certain courses from top universities on Coursera, which will now supplement their learning. So we sat down with that person, we understood what the course outline was, and we presented to this person different options that we had available in our catalog. So the person is now supplementing that certification with these learning programs that we've rolled out on these platforms. That's how we've managed it so far.
Okay, thank you. I will do a combined question. It refers to earlier the shift measurement, which we talked about. And one of the questions is basically, 2 of the questions kind of is, how do you measure a behavioral shift?
Okay. Good question. So there are multiple ways in which we do it. So we classify behavior under short term and long term. The long term is done through a 360 program or a 360 feedback. So the leadership program that we've run or that we're running within our organization is a year-long journey. So all participants who get signed up for the leadership program have to go through a 360 feedback before, and they have to go through a 360 feedback 3 months after they complete the 1-year journey, right? So in effect, what we're doing is we're giving people about 15 to 16 months for them to start working on their leadership styles and start showing the change that they have through the program. So that's the long-term approach that we take. What we do on Exonify is the following. So if a person sort of goes through a communication skills program, we run a feedback or a survey on Exonify before the program. We then go back and take the same feedback from their stakeholders 3 months after the program to really see, for example, if they've changed anything around their communication style or are they doing anything differently, right? So 2 ways, like I said, in which we do it: short term, which is done on Exonify within a gap of about 3 to 4 months. Long term, on the leadership journey, we do it through a 360 feedback before and after the program.
Okay, thank you. And another very interesting question, and it is it fair to force someone into digital learning if this is not their learning style, and how do you cater for them?
Honestly, is it fair to force anyone to do anything? The answer to that is a no, right? I'd say I think you have to dig deeper to really go back and understand what the resistance to is, right? It may not necessarily be towards digital. Oftentimes, in my experience, it's got to do with the lack of knowledge around the value a tool could potentially add. So I'd say go back and show them the merits without meaning to sound like you're selling the tool to them. Also go back and understand their expectations, right? Because I mean, if you were to, for example, as much as I'm talking about digital learning, if you were to come back and ask me to attend a leadership program in a digital manner completely, I'd say no to that, right? So it's also about the specific needs around learning that people have. So long as you can map it back to that, you may find some success. But if the person's completely closed and they don't want it, it's like me trying to give a telescope to a blind person to appreciate the beauty of a galaxy, right? If the person's not willing and they don't have the capability to see the value, there's only so much you can do. But I just say begin by understanding what the resistance is around. Begin by understanding what their specific needs are. Try addressing them, but if they're still close to it, I don't think anybody can do anything at all around it.
Yeah, thank you. And we've got time for one last question. Thank you so much, everyone, for all your contributions and questions. And I think this is really important, actually, to highlight the KPIs. And there is one question that we have here asking for what was the engagement percentage that you are aiming for by the end of your first year?
So we're already in our second year. We were at a 95% at the end of year 1. We've dipped a little bit, but we're still way above the industry standards. We are at an 80% as we speak, because also our number of licenses have gone up, right? We've shot up from about a 350 to a 550 this year. So obviously it requires a different engagement plan that we're putting together right now. The target that we've taken internally in terms of engagement is about an 85%, and that's what we hope to achieve by the end of this year.
Okay, thank you. And just very quick question. We've got Neha, who is asking for an advice. And what do you think about CIPD course? Would it help in developing career in talent management?
Good question. I'm a big propagator of CIPD. I just got awarded my fellow myself last week. I love the experience. I think it's a great learning platform. Depending on the route that you want to take, because I took the experience assessment route, so that was a completely different one. But I do know of people who've attended CIPD and they've had some very, very good things to say about it. So if you're looking at a career in HR, if you're looking at a career in talent management or any other aspect of HR, I definitely recommend you look at CIPD as one of the options for sure.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for this, Sriram, and thank you so much everyone for joining us. Just before I say final goodbye, I would like to remind you all that HR Summit and Expo is taking place here in Dubai, November 12th until the 14th. We have lots of workshops and content now focusing on HR technology and e-learning platforms. So you're more than welcome to come at the event and meet our trainers and speakers face to face. Thank you. Have a great day and join us again for our next Digital Week, where we'll keep you informed when it be held. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you everyone for joining. Appreciate the time.